Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's talk on the topic of access concentration and dhyanas. So we're continuing to explore our meditation practice. If you remember, 2 weeks ago, we looked at the system of practice, the 5 stages involved in our system. That's integration, positive emotion, letting go, sometimes known as spiritual death, transformation, also known as spiritual rebirth, and the stage of no practice or spiritual receptivity. And we looked at the various practices supporting those stages: so mindfulness of breathing, metta bhavana, reflection on the 3 lakshanas or 5 skandhas, recollection of the Buddha, and just sitting as being some of the practices that we use within our system. And today we're going to look at the place of access concentration and dhyana within that system. So first of all, let's say that access concentration and dhyana are not something different from these practices that we engage in our everyday practice. They're not something else that we have to do. They're not something outside of the 5 stages, but they're very much an integral part of it. So to say a little bit about what those terms mean, access concentration simply means that state of mind that gives us access to the higher states of consciousness. And the term dhyana, in which we're using it today, is the name given to those higher states of consciousness. Dhyana can also just be used to mean meditation in general, but it also has this specific connotation of these higher states of consciousness. So access concentration itself arises out of our meditation practice. Whatever that meditation is, we can move into access concentration from it when we have the right conditions in place. I'll say a little bit more later on about the conditions that support access concentration. The dhyanas, or the higher levels of consciousness, are generally put into 2 groups of 4. So the first 4 are called the form dhyanas, so called because they arise from experience based in the body. The second 4 are the formless dhyanas, which we could say perhaps are purely cognitive states. Now today we're just going to be looking at the first 4, the form dhyanas. There's an important point about this sequence that we need to understand, and that is that although it's presented as a sequence of apparently separate stages, so we talk about access concentration, moving into first dhyana, moving into second dhyana, moving into third dhyana, and then into fourth dhyana. That's really just, I think, a convenient way of talking about an experience that is more a progressive continuation from access concentration through to the fourth dhyana. And we progress through this sequence by fully engaging with whichever state we happen to be in at the moment. The following stage just arises naturally from that. We can't willfully bring any particular stage of the process into being, certainly not in a sustainable way. So we can't, for example, sit down to meditate and think, right, well, yesterday I did first and second dhyana, so today I'm going to do third and fourth dhyana. It doesn't quite work like that. We go through this natural progression from our normal meditative state through to the states of higher consciousness. And this brings up for me a question of effort in meditation. How much effort do we need to make in order to bring about these higher states of consciousness? can we make too much effort? Well, we need to have a balanced and dynamic approach to our practice. Not enough effort, and I'm sure we've all experienced this from time to time. If we don't put enough effort in, then we just drift around. You know, we're caught up in one thought or memory, an idea or a fantasy after another. It's just an endless sequence, stumbling from one hindrance to another, and never really engaging with the practice, never really getting very far. On the other hand, too much effort, and we can become tense, we can become rigid, we can become over-focused. We lose sight of the purpose of our meditation because we're simply focused on the desire to become concentrated and attain something at the expense of everything else. This overly willful approach can be driven in part by our ego clinging, by our self-identification with the practice, by seeing it as my meditation, my experience of dhyana, my attainment of this level or that level, etc. By wanting to achieve results, and even perhaps a sense of competitiveness in our practice. You know, that sense of, well, of course, you know, I can just get into third dhyana at will. It's easy. It's easy for me. Oh, you can't? Oh, that's a shame. You know, that sense of a bit of one-upmanship in the practice. So that's something to be avoided with this willful attitude towards our meditation practice. There's also a danger, of course, of being too literal-minded in our approach to the practice. So we very often present it in a way of almost like a list. It's almost like a list of ingredients that you get on a package of processed food. You know, so many carbohydrates, so much protein, and so on, so much fat, so much sugar, and put it all together, and you've got this product. And we have these lists. We have the lists of the dhyana factors. So first dhyana, you have this, this, and this. Second dhyana, well, you don't have that, but you do have this, and so on through the dhyanas. And there's a danger there in becoming fixated on ticking the boxes on, well, yeah, today I experienced that, that, and that, but I didn't experience that, so I must have been in this dhyana, and so on. We can get a bit too literal-minded. We bring too much of an expectation to the practice of how it's going to be. And of course, invariably, it doesn't turn out to be how we expect it to be. You know, our approach to meditation is far more productive if we can just come with an open mind without any predetermined ideas of how the practice is going to turn out. Just being open to what arises in our practice, with the appropriate use of, obviously, with effort and application. There are things that we do need to do in our meditation practice. As we spoke last week about working with the hindrances, that's the main place where we have to put our effort. We don't put our effort into getting into dhyana. We put our effort into overcoming the hindrances, and thus allowing these higher states of consciousness to arise naturally. The Buddha in his teachings used imagery a lot to, I think, probably to counter what he knew would be a tendency amongst people to be too literal-minded about conceptual ideas of the practice. And there's some very beautiful imagery around the dhyanas. Quite briefly, the Buddha speaks of the first dhyana as like mixing soap powder with water, so that each one is completely absorbed into the other with no residue left over. And that's this imagery for the pleasure that arises in first dhyana. The second dhyana is like, the mind is like a clear, still lake with no inlets or outlets. And at the bottom of that lake, from an underground source, arises pure, clear water coming into the lake, cool water flooding into the lake and spreading out throughout the entire lake. an image for the sense of bliss arising in the mind in second dhyana. And in the third dhyana, we have the image of a lotus growing in that lake, completely suffused in the water, its roots, its stems, its flowers, totally suffused with the water from the lake. And this again brings out this imagery of the fullness of the mind, completely saturated with bliss. And the fourth dhyana says it's like a man stepping out from a pool having bathed and then wrapping himself from head to foot in a pure, clean white cloth. So we have this sense of the equanimity of the fourth dhyana, being totally enclosed in this pure white cloth, this pure state of mind. So there's some beautiful imagery there that can help to counter perhaps if we had a tendency towards being too literal minded around the conceptual formulations of what these higher states of experience that we call dhyana actually are. So by maintaining a constant mindfulness of what's going on in our experience, we can adjust the degree of effort that we need to make to match where we are as we progress through the practice. So how do we start with all this? How do we start with this progression into access, concentration and dhyana? Well, you could say that we start by getting nice and focused in our meditation practice, but I think it goes back a bit earlier than that. We could say that it starts when we sit down on our meditation cushion and we begin to go through perhaps a body scan in preparation for our practice. But I think it even starts earlier than that. This whole process starts with what we do in our everyday lives from moment to moment. It starts with having a sound ethical practice to support our meditation. If we're trying to develop these higher states of consciousness, that won't happen in a mind that's troubled by feelings of regret about unskillful behavior, or maybe even feelings of guilt about unskillful behavior. If we're troubled in that way in our minds, then moving into higher states of consciousness is going to be extremely difficult. So we start with how we behave off the cushions. That's really where access, concentration and dhyana begin. And then we develop that as we come to sit. We bring ourselves into our present experience. We ground ourselves in the experience of the body, and then we turn to the experience of the mind. So it begins in that sense from our meditation practice. That can be any one of the meditation practices. It could be a devotional practice, puja, or chanting a mantra. It can arise even through an experience of nature, an experience of being at one with the natural world around us. And sometimes we get these experiences of absorption through engagement with aesthetic beauty, with the arts, with music. There are various ways of approaching it, ways that work on calming and focusing the mind. But meditation practice is probably the one that we're all most familiar with. So we start to calm the mind by focusing mainly on one thing, be it the breath or be it the person in the metta bhavana. But we focus in a relaxed way, not in a tense, tight, rigid way. And as we become more and more focused, we don't let go of our broader awareness of the whole of our experience. So we engage with the object of our meditation, if you like, bringing along an awareness of the whole of our being, our body, our heart, our mind. It's all in there. It has to be all in there. If we're not integrated in that way, then we're not going to get into these more developed states of consciousness. And as the mind calms, as we become more focused, more settled, we start to notice a bit more the hindrances that are present. Often the hindrances are hidden behind the mass of distracting thoughts that are going on, but we begin to see the underlying hindrances that are driving those thoughts. Those of you who were here last week will remember we spoke about the hindrances being craving, aversion, sloth and torpor, restlessness and anxiety and doubt. Now, there are various ways that we can work with the hindrances, and we mentioned some of that last week. I don't have time to go back over that this week, but you can look on last week's YouTube video and get some ideas on dealing with the hindrances. So with the gross manifestations of the hindrances removed, well, at least for now, it'd be a bit ambitious to think they're gone forever. They certainly won't. But for temporarily, for the duration of the meditation that we're engaged in, we can work on getting beyond the hindrances, removing them from the mind for the moment. And as we do that, we find it easier to concentrate. Concentration begins to flow. It's less of an effort, and it even begins to feel pleasant, perhaps. We begin to feel that pleasure of a natural state of concentration. And this is an indication that we're entering into that stage that we would call access concentration. We're now moving towards the higher states of consciousness. And if we can stay with this experience without grasping onto it, without clinging to it, without that sense of, oh, this is good, oh, I like this, oh, I must do this again, I hope I can do this tomorrow, can't wait for this to finish, I can tell my mates about it. You know, that sort of clinging on to the experience, trying to appropriate the experience for our ego needs, will almost certainly bring it to an end very, very quickly. But if we can stay with the experience without grasping it, then it will naturally deepen and transition into the first stage of dhyana. And in this first stage of dhyana, typically we would experience pleasurable sensations that have a strong physical element to them. It's called rapture. And so this manifests perhaps through, well, it can manifest in almost any way, really. I'm a bit reluctant to say how it might manifest for me, because with the best will in the world, you're then going to have that mental image in your mind, and then you're going to be wondering why it's not manifesting like that for you. But let's just say that rapture manifests as predominantly physical pleasure in the body. It can be very subtle. It doesn't have to be an earth-shattering experience. For some people it is. For a lot of people it isn't. It can be a very subtle experience. Also present are the beginnings of a mental experience of pleasure called sukha or bliss, although it's not the dominant feature of the first dhyana. And there is still some thinking going on. There's still some discursive thought, quite subtle though, not strong enough to disturb our concentration. And again, if we can just stay with this, if we can sit with these experiences without grasping onto them, without putting up any barriers to them, then gradually this sense of physical pleasure will fade away, and the sense of bliss, of mental pleasure, will increase. As the sense of physical pleasure fades away, the sense of the physical body also tends to fade away with it. So the mental pleasure increases, the subtle thinking will cease, and we're now into second dhyana. Again, staying with this sense of pleasure, this sense of bliss, just allowing it to unfold quite naturally, without grasping onto it. The process continues into the third dhyana, where the bliss completely saturates our mind. And then gradually that bliss starts to give way to something that lies beyond it. And now we're moving into the territory of the fourth dhyana, where we completely transcend all experience of pleasure and pain. The mind rests in a state of equanimity. So now even the mental bliss has, in a way, well, Sangha puts it as we move into a state of pleasure beyond pleasure. So not quite sure that I can say from experience what that state is, but a state of equanimity is how it's described traditionally. A state of no thought, of no bodily sensation, of no mental disturbance. But that's not to say it's a state of nothingness, a state of absence. It certainly has positive qualities, and it's a state in which we're fully awake and fully aware of what it is that we're experiencing, completely absorbed in the present moment. So Sangha says that it should be possible with practice for a well-balanced, integrated human being to dwell in first dhyana all the time. And I'm sure that we'd all like to turn up for our meditation, settle on our cushions, close our eyes, and drop straight into dhyana. I'm sure we'd think that was a lovely experience. But unfortunately, for most of us, it's not like that. So for most of us, our working ground continues to be dealing with the hindrances, working on settling the mind, building our concentration. And then when we do begin to enter access concentration and start to progress to the dhyanas, it's most likely that our experience is fleeting and unstable. It's very, very easily disturbed. The hindrances aren't that far away, and they're very, very adept at finding a little crack in our armor and sneaking back in again. Particularly our tendency to grasp onto what we find pleasant will immediately revive the hindrance of craving. And then when we realize we've dropped back into craving out of the higher state of consciousness, we probably start looking around for someone to blame for that. And we focus on the person who just happened to cough on the far side of the shrine room. And our minds start going, well, if they hadn't coughed, I'd still be in dhyana now. It's all their fault. So there again, the hindrance of ill will has now arisen. And so we find ourselves back in the grip of the hindrances. And all we can do then, of course, is just start working with the hindrances again, starting to build up our sense of calm and relaxed concentration, and moving towards the progression into access concentration and dhyana once more. And we just keep doing that. We keep doing that over and over and over again. There's no magic bullet, I'm afraid. It really is practice. I guess that's why we call it meditation practice. We have to do it over and over and over again. But as we practice, learning as we go along what are the best conditions for us to work in, becoming aware of how our mind works, how it responds, maintaining an awareness of the heart, the body, and the mind, so we can develop the ability to remain in these higher states of consciousness for longer and longer periods of time, until eventually we can stay at will in the dhyanas. We can choose how long we're going to remain in the dhyanas, rather than just the mind flipping out every time something comes along and disturbs it. So that's our working ground. That's what we're working towards. That's where our meditation practice can take us. And I hope that's given you some sense of where meditation can go if you haven't already traveled that ground for yourself. Thank you.